Welcome to Clueless Tabletop, where you can follow along as I try to figure out how to build a diorama using this Special Operations Team Kit, as well as a 3D printed flesh monster abomination from DM Stash. There's a little plate armored knight in there that doesn't match the theme, but I'll try and cover it up. I started building the kit first. Most of my model building kit experience comes from things like Warhammer, so I'm used to step-by-step instructions. So even though this kit was simple and well thought out, it took me forever. I stopped filming after building one guy, but the only modifications I made were putting on some of their hats backwards, because cool guys wear backwards hats. My idea for the diorama layout was that the team would be inside a building and the monster is just outside. I'm going to have a wall splitting down the middle at an angle to make it a little bit more interesting of a build. The medic will be treating the injured guy on one side, and the guy with the little stick will be holding up a curtain so the last guy can be preparing to take a shot out the window. So I did my best to mark the angle to cut the wall at. Then I used a speed square to mark my lines. But I only had a box cutter to make the cuts, so it wasn't the cleanest work I've ever done. But at the end of the day, I guess it worked. Then it only took me 3 attempts to put it on the right way to make sure that I had the cuts right. I decided to add some more height to the inside floor off camera. Then I went ahead and added some pink styrofoam to this gesso board for the ground outside. I used foam safe superglue and accelerant to attach it, and just like the first step, I flipped it over. I made the cleanest cuts I could with the box cutter, and then I made sure it fit. I then started to mark out the bricks for the wall. I paid no attention to scale and just eyeballed it. I believe this diorama is at 1/32 scale because I had to look it up later when I had to reprint some oil drums that were comically too small. But my intention for the bricks were to be like large concrete poured bricks, which I think the scale I improvised works for. I then used my mechanical pencil to score out the mortar joints and lines, allowing myself to be messy to kind of lean into the wear and tear of the building. And I followed it up with a box cutter to make the lines more defined and take out some chunks of the brick at random. I then marked where the window should be using the models and then cut it out. And then I wanted some external lights for an OSL I planned to paint. So I kit bashed these with the tops of a super glue bottle. I glued the green stoppers inside the lid, then glued them to the wall. Then I began to mark out where the monster would be. I decided to have like a puddle trail behind him filled with bones and like flesh bits, and then fill it with some bloody liquid once I figure out how to do that. I started by cutting out a deep hole for the monster with the box cutter, then cleaned it up with the Dremel while wearing a mask, and then took forever to clean it up afterwards. I wanted to make this wall more interesting because it was starting to look like a face, so I cut a chunk out of the corner and made some damage marks with the remaining bricks. Then I drilled some holes and glued in styrene rods to be kind of like exposed rebar. It was then time to cover the foam using some Mod Podge and black paint, which I had very little of. I should have watered it down because it was very thick. I also made a mess while putting it on. I'm not sure why I only wore one glove. But I ended up spraying it with some isopropyl alcohol, then like brushing off the excess. I'm sure I learned that somewhere, but I can't remember where. Wish I could give whoever I learned that from credit. I then added some bits of balsa wood to the window interior, as well as some boards on the outside and inside to make the building seem more abandoned. I then re-glued one of the lights that I knocked off while painting and fumbled around with this guitar string to add in some wires, both underneath the lights with a little bit of a bend, and then on the inside of the building. I then used like a curved part of a paper clip to mark where the lights ran through the wall to the back side. I glued on all the extra part of the military kit as scatter, then very scientifically used this model to figure out the scale for the size of a chem light, which I then shot across my room as I tried to cut the styrene rod. And I definitely did not recover that piece. But after gluing that on, I decided to amputate this injure guy and then use some paper clip to kind of have exposed bone, because I figured he needed a reason for that medic to treat him with a giant monster outside. I lastly added some Vallejo mud texture to the ground, added the rest of the scatter, and it was ready to prime. I pulled out the airbrush to start painting up the monster first. Using a gradient of pinks with the airbrush, I built up the flesh tones, and then I went back and added some purple from the bottom for like shadows and bruising. Luckily I have an Emperor's Children themed army, so I had all of these colors already mixed up. And then I lastly sprayed over a layer of flesh contrast. I think it was Gilliman flesh. I honestly wish I would have skipped that. I like this pink and purple by itself, but you learn as you go. Then moving to the painting desk and the regular brush, I started to paint up these bones and spikes before realizing I wanted a flesh dry brush, and then painted up these veins with Incubi Darkness, hit up the bones with a contrast, and then painted these boils with Flayed One Flesh. I then covered everything with some washes, some purples and reds on the boils, and then kind of flesh wash over everything, which I wish I would have skipped. I tend to paint a lot of details and then just muddy it with washes for no reason, but it ended up working out. And then I highlighted everything, as well as started to paint up these eyes. It kind of has eyeballs all over it. So I put in some white and a dark purple contrast, and then added in some reflections. And then I painted up the claws separately with a dark brown and Ushabti bone over top of it, so the claws kind of stand out. Moving back to the airbrush for the soldiers, I built up a green tone or gradient, as that was going to be the main color. I didn't want a full camo effect, mainly because I'm lazy, so I planned to just break it up with the brush with some browns, blacks, grayish greens to kind of define the details, as well as a variety of flesh and hair colors. I figured this is some unnamed monster hunting unit, so it didn't need official camo. I then added green and brown washes before adding some highlights. Moving to the terrain, I airbrushed on a light gray to the brick from a top angle, trying to kind of maintain the black in the mortar lines. I then moved on to like a steel metallic for the barrel and the lights. And then added on a rust metallic kind of loosely on top of that, followed up by a non-metallic rust, which I also started to add to the bricks, as well as all the other colors you see me airbrush, including this wood for the panels, as well as the first layer on the ground, a dark brown, a light brown, a dark and light green for the grass, as well as the grime on the wall, and then kind of covered everything with a grayish green contrast paint to one, darken it, and two, kind of tie everything together. Back to the paint desk and the regular brush to paint up the bones and flesh parts inside of the pit. And then most of the work was done with washes. I used some Croat green, Agrax brown, Soul Blight gray, and Targar flesh shade, and kind of just put it on at random and kind of messy, then dabbed it on with a sponge. And then I started to paint up the smaller metal bits, then added some chipping by sponging on a bright metal, as well as sponging on some rust orange, and then covering everything with a dark wash, or at least all the metals with a dark wash. I used some oil stain and fresh rust effects to add a little bit more, as well as some mud and blood effects that I did off camera. I then decided to mix up Vallejo still water texture and contrast paint to fill the monster pit with after gluing the monster on. I then let it dry for a day, but as you will see later, I should have waited too. I soaked an old t-shirt from my garage in coffee grounds and water to make the window curtain material. And at this point in the video, yes, my nails are painted, you're not crazy. I then beat up this strip of material and destroyed my hobby mat in the process and nearly burned myself, so don't copy me. I then glued it on with the soldiers, allowing the guy with the stick to hold up the curtain. I then used UHU glue to add some more gore trails for the monster. I wish I would have used a container. I could get closer to the model to be more effective. The glue kind of dried before I got it on. Then I added some flesh tear contrast, and lastly, dry brushed on some wet mud to the ground, mainly to cover up a mistake I made earlier on. I pulled out the airbrush one last time for the OSL, starting with the white for the glowing parts. I kind of went a little heavy-handed on the white, so I ended up having to make a bigger OSL than I wanted. As I was doing the red, I realized that the water texture was leaking, so I guess it wasn't dried all the way. That's why I should have given it 2 days instead of 1. So I let it dry a bit before going back to adding the yellow OSL, which was much bigger than I wanted. But I kind of recovered with some shadow with contrast paints. And then I lastly moved on to painting all of the trim and the sides of the brick black, and then I called it done. Thanks so much for watching.